King John is where we will begin our story. He reigned from 1199 to 1216. He was not really known as the nicest guy. By 1206, he had lost several wars and was looking to restore his prestige by gaining back some of the territory he had lost in these battles. This required money and lots of it, so John began imposing heavy taxes and exploiting his royal rights more harshly. The people did not like this. Not just the poor, but even the nobles and clergy disagreed. In fact, the king's own men formed an army called the Army of God and overtook London. After a small civil war broke out in 1215, resulting in yet another loss for King John, the people demanded he sign a document called the Magna Carta. Now the king was just as much subject to the rule of law as were his own people. In this document, we see the idea of limited government and individual rights. We also see taxation by consent, meaning the king must now get permission by the representative people before he can impose taxes. And we also see the ideas of jury trials. The king can no longer be the judge. The Magna Carta starts the English Parliament. Anytime the king needs money, the king must ask Parliament to tax the people. If the Parliament agrees, they will give him the money. The king's powers are now significantly limited. After King John's rule ended in 1216, things seemed to flow fairly smoothly until the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. When Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, she did not have an heir to the throne. Her cousin from Scotland, King James, filled the vacancy. The Scottish monarchy does not really favor the idea of limited government. In fact, they believe in absolutism and the divine right of kings. When James refuses to level with the English people, they decide to overthrow him and cut his head off. His son Charles, and then James II, would eventually take over. Charles II gets rid of the Parliament and is Catholic, so he is not too well liked in a Protestant nation. When he dies and his brother James II takes over, he too is Catholic and pro-absolutism in a predominantly Protestant nation. The English decide to again overthrow their monarchy, but this time James II just flees, and it was a pretty easy battle for the English. This is known as the Bloodless Revolution. Now there is another vacancy. This time, 1682, James II's son-in-law, William III of Orange, and his daughter Mary II take the throne. This is called the Glorious Revolution because for the first time, England has two monarchs that are willing to finally provide rights for their citizens and limit their own power. They agree to sign the English Bill of Rights. This is going to apply to the American colonists later on. Parliament is now supreme and makes the laws. Executive power is limited. There will be free and frequent elections. The monarch can only tax with consent of Parliament. In this English Bill of Rights, there's also the Declaration of Rights, which has things like freedom of speech, the right to petition, and the right to provide arms for their defense. But there is no religious freedom in there. Locke is going to be the most influential philosopher at the time, especially concerning natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Locke takes a bottom-up approach. The people get together and decide what they need from their government. A social contract is made. In order to preserve our lives, liberty, and property, we will give up some of our freedom to be protected. Locke also believed in religious toleration and government by consent. The government is only legitimate as long as the people consent to it. People have the right of revolution in this case. Colonists will bring all of these traditions, the English Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Rights, and Locke's ideas, with them to the New World. Colonial governments were established between 1607 to 1733. Each had its own government with a governor, legislature, and court. These governments are still under the British monarchy. However, in these early governments, we see the idea of a written constitution, a legislature of elected representatives, and separation of powers. However, there were still some shortfalls of the colonial governments. Women and enslaved persons could not vote, and every colony had some type of property qualification for voting. Examples of written constitutions are the Mayflower Compact, which had the idea of self-government created out of a necessity after the Pilgrims got lost and ended up in present-day Massachusetts instead of Virginia. We also have the Great Fundamentals, the first basic system of English laws in the colonies. And, of course, our very first formal constitution, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. This combines the Mayflower Compact, a plan for governing, with the Great Fundamentals, the first laws. Examples of legislatures with elected representatives would be the House of Burgesses, established in 1619. This is the first colonial legislature with the power to tax. Property-owning men could vote, and this is where we see the idea of the consent of the governed. Remember that for the first part of our history, the English let the colonies develop as they would. They made their own laws, traded, and taxed without English control. Each colony had a charter between the colony and the King of England or Parliament. The king would choose the governor, but the state legislatures controlled the governor's salary, so they could keep him in line with colonial wishes. Consent of the governed. American legislatures grew from Parliament. An example of separation of powers would be the colonial charters dividing the power of government between a governor chosen by the king to have executive power and the legislatures which had the power to pass laws and hear court cases. While the colonies seemed to be functioning fine, practically independent of British rule, this would all change with the French and Indian War in 1756. The French and Indian War in 1756, in a nutshell, was when France was encroaching on our territory in the colonies. The Native American population in the colonies at that time supported France, and the British did not like this. In the end, the British gained Canada and Florida, which strengthened the American colonies by removing rivals in the North and the South. The downside was that this war was expensive, and from the British point of view, colonists should help pay for it, especially considering that, in their point of view, England believed it was protecting the colonists from French and Indian threats. In order to pay for this war, the English decided to impose heavy taxes on the colonists and crack down on smuggling that was done outside the British guidelines for trade in the colonists. This was all done under a new king, King George III. In Lesson 6, we will take a look at the following timeline leading to the American Revolutionary War.